Let us look at the effect of snow structure and snow cover stratigraphy in the ecosystem of Arctic. See, the snow structure and the snow cover stratigraphy is very crucial because this actually determines how the animal access to food beneath the snow. While when there is a presence of weak layers, which is called as depth hoar, or slip planes, the crust or ice layers in the snowpack, this increases the potential for avalanche release. Now we will see why this is very important to understand the cryospheres and how they affect the population, especially the plant and animal population living in the Arctic region. So more snow or ice layers in the snowpack are going to be very hard for the reindeer to penetrate. So the reindeers which are grazing on these areas, they are unable to find the food if the ice is very thick. More frequent winter thaws and rain on snow events can make catastrophic consequences for the animal population. The one thing is, like, if it is ice, the reindeer can walk very easily. But if it is a slush is formed when the rain falls on the ice, actually it melts. So when it is slush, what happens is, like, reindeer's legs will penetrate the ice and it will make it very hard for the reindeer to walk. In other words, they have to spend a lot of energy. When there is also slush, the another problem is identifying the food or getting the food. Grazing plants are also going to be very difficult for the reindeer. And an ice layer at the bottom of the snowpack, called as the basal ice, is an important problem for Arctic grazing animals, because if the ice layer forms early in the season and restricts access to the forage for an extended period, if the ice is formed very early, then that also leads to a big problem. So precipitation leads to a problem, and also if the ice is actually forming much earlier when the season starts, then that is also going to be a big problem for many of the grazing animals, because now the food is no longer available, it is covered with ice. The basal ice layers can form at any time during the snow season from thaw events followed by subsequent refreezing. So the refreezing is the major problem, and that leads to many of the grazing animals, they could not reach the plants which are below. And how it affects the permafrost. So in the permafrost, when there is a change in the glacier's cryosphere, so this leads to hydrological process and the geomorphological processes are getting affected. And also what is the impact is, means it affects the ecology, biogeochemical cycling, water resources and infrastructure maintenance and development. All these things are getting affected when there is a change in the ice. So here is recent observations on the permafrost. The one is the temperature increase which is seen due to Arctic amplification. So there is a documented increase in the temperature across the Arctic region. The SWEPA report 2011 talks about that. And high regional variation in the climate warming rates and magnitudes are being observed. And what it actually is, the consequence of this is the change in the active layer. So there is an increase in the thickness of active layer because due to seasonal change in the precipitation as well as freezing, there is an increase in the thickness of active layer, and this progressive increase over the Eurasia and Central Asia, these are all the two regions where there is more ice that is being seen, and there is a recent loss of permafrost in lower latitude sites. So if we look at the permafrost as the main thing, so we can start from the ecosystem. So permafrost leads to drying of wetland habitats and pond formation in some areas due to cryosphere change. And when we talk about the biogeochemical cycling, so there is an increased methane emission from new wetland. That means increase of temperature releases more greenhouse gases which are stored, and release of significant carbon stored in the permafrost. So these are all the two major things that is happening because of the increase in the temperature. And when we talk about the infrastructure, there is an impact on the coastlines with ice-rich unconsolidated materials. That means road and construction, houses and other things are getting disturbed because of permafrost thawing. And in the landforms, when we say the ground slumping and the slope instability is actually seen. These are all the effects of increase in the temperature that affects the permafrost in the Arctic region. So what are the risks and uncertainties? The major risk is the release of methane gas. This happens in the continental shelves, and also there is a high uncertainty regarding the extent and the impact, because we are only learning about these kind of changes very recently. So there are lots of studies which are required to find out what is the actual effect and can we prevent it. These are some of the things which is the major challenge faced by many of the scientists who are trying to understand the Arctic cryosphere mechanisms. So we have talked about the effect of climate. So how the change in the cryosphere affects the climate? One is local or the regional impact. So local or regional impact, when we talk about, there is how much it is going to affect basically depends on the magnitude, timing, location, duration of ice cover and size of the water body. Because water body, when it is present, that can refreeze. So when it refreezes, that also affects the local and regional areas. And the second one is what are the influencing factor, means basically they are the surface heat fluxes which affects the climate, and also climatic variables and the difference between lakes and rivers. So these are all the major influencing factors that affect the climate. And what are the relationship and the impact? If you look at the cryosphere components, basically ice. So this is linked with the landscapes, seascapes, ecosystems, humans in the Arctic, and global climate change and ecological systems. In our textual material, we will be discussing more about all these effects, how they are interrelated and how the change in the cryosphere affects landscapes, seascapes, ecosystems, humans in the Arctic, and the global climate and ecological systems. And Arctic warming basically affects the temporal and spatial distribution of cryospheric components. That's the reason we also have to be concerned. Arctic amplification leads to melting, so the cryosphere changes, and how it affects the Arctic region, that also we have to see. And there is a distribution of water in solid, liquid and gaseous form. So how this changes, because if the temperature is low, we will be having refreezing of water, and if there is Arctic amplification, then the ice will melt, leads to more open water. Because of Arctic amplification, the surface temperature also increases. That means in the atmosphere also there are changes that is happening. And this is only we are talking about the Arctic region, but unfortunately what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. So it also affects the global system. So the change in the Arctic cryosphere affects the entire planet as a whole. So how the connections are actually present and seen is basically we have two major things. One is the cryosphere and hydrosphere. So there is a shift in the cryosphere that leads to impact on Arctic hydrosphere. So cryosphere means the low temperature items, basically ice sheets, glaciers and other things. So when there is a change, the ice melts, leading to formation of water. So the cryosphere changes leads to changes in the hydrosphere, that is water based bodies are also getting affected. And the distribution of water in different states, that also is changing because of the change in the cryosphere. This is in the Arctic region, and when we look at the global implication, this is having a widespread effect. For example, when there is more water getting into the Arctic Ocean, then it actually goes to the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. So the ocean circulations are getting affected, and similarly the vertical mixing of water also is getting affected. Wind pattern changes because of the temperature variation in the Arctic region. So when there is a change in the Arctic cryosphere, that not only affects the Arctic region, it also affects the global regions. So what are the problems faced by the Arctic inhabitants, that means the Arctic people? One is the physical environment components where they changes. The snow drifts, lakes and rivers with frozen ice, icebergs, permafrost. The cryosphere plays a fundamental role in the lives of Arctic inhabitants, particularly indigenous communities. It shapes their cultural practice, subsistence, lifestyles and economic activities. The changes in the cryosphere can have profound implications for food security, as the traditional hunting and fishing grounds become less accessible or they become less productive. And also, say for example, if there is a reduction in the sea ice, this impacts the hunting of marine mammals. So this is a major problem, which are critical food source for many of the Arctic inhabitants. And also, thawing permafrost can disrupt the infrastructure, which affects transportation and housing, which leads to increased vulnerability and adaptation changes for local communities. So these are all the major problems that happens because of changes in the cryosphere for the local Arctic inhabitants. And when we look at the role in climate regulation, there are three major things we can look into. One is the local and regional control. So here the heat transport from lower altitude to the Arctic happens, and also cooling of air and water masses occurs in the Arctic region. The return of cold air and ocean currents to southern latitude. So that is how the air circulation actually gets affected because of the change in the Arctic region. So the Arctic region behaves like a cold sink, that it actually absorbs lot of heat from the rest of the world. So it functions as a cold sink, facilitating the heat transfer from lower latitude to Arctic and cooling air and water masses. This process actually plays a vital role in maintaining the Earth's temperature balance. So this is the major thing what the Arctic cryospheres are doing, the good part for the entire globe. When we talk about the albedo effect, where the snow and ice covered surface reflects solar radiation back into the space, this further contributes to the cooling of the plant. So these are all the positive effects of the cryosphere. And when we talk about how cryosphere can help in carbon sequestration, so in the summer vegetation, the growth is going to be seen in a higher amount. So that leads to capture of atmospheric CO2. That means these plants can capture the CO2 and make photosynthesis. So removal of carbon dioxide actually takes place, and organic matter is also accumulated in the soil during the time, and the larger carbon sinks are basically the permafrost soils. They actually had the maximum amount of carbon present in the entire globe. So we are actually seeing there is a change in the cryosphere. So from 1980 onwards, there is a major change that is being observed. The first one is there is a downward trend in frozen water proportion, and also there is a change in the melt to freeze cycle timings. So these are all the changes that are happening, and by knowing this we can actually find out what are all the implications that are going to happen in the future. So this will alter the distribution of liquid water and water vapors, and also it will affect the major changes to the physical and chemical environment. This leads to shift in condition of living species, especially the marine mammals which are living there, and the potential alteration in the Arctic role in the global system, because now both are interdependent on each other for the climate changes. So here is the map which clearly talks about the various effects. So there are 10 effects given here. In the textual content, I will be explaining all the things in a very detailed format. And here let us look at only the major 10 points which are given here. If you look at here, the numbers are from 1 to 10 it is given. So we will just look at what are the individual processes very quickly. The first one is melting and retreating snow cover that increases the radiation absorption, that is a radiative feedback. The second one is melting of large ice sheet contribute to sea level rise and the freshwater flux with potential effects on thermohaline circulation and global climate. The third one is retreating sea ice contributes to increased radiative absorption, that is ice albedo feedback, and heat and moisture fixtures to the atmosphere which impact cloud cover. Then the fourth one is, as permafrost degrade, methane production may increase. With wetland drying, carbon dioxide emission may increase and the atmosphere warms over time. The fifth one is, thawing permafrost changes geomorphic and geochemical processes and fluxes. The sixth one is, increasing precipitation plus melting snow and ice increases river flow and changes of freshwater flux. The seventh one is, shrinking lake ice cover has ecological impact, generally leading to greater productivity but negatively impacting surface transport. The eighth one is, changes in the magnitude and timing of snow melt, runoff and river ice processes have both positive and negative impact. The ninth one is, retreating glacier initially increases runoff but lower flows eventually result as ice masses diminish. Then the last one is, changes in cloud cover affect the surface radiation budget, which impacts sea ice, in turn affecting cloud cover. This is called as the cloud radiation feedback. So here is a chart explaining many of the changes that is happening. So when there is a change in the cryosphere, that means less snow on the ground. So why or how it happens is because this may be due to the decreased snowfall, or it may be snowfall later in the year. So these two leads to less snow on the ground, and this has various impact. The first one is can no longer make igloos. That means the local population cannot make their house because the ice is not very strong, so they cannot actually make their house. And then using the tents more often because igloos difficult to build, and this leads to higher cost and to add to new vehicle to buy new equipment, that is for tent. So that means the local population is affected because they have less snow now. And if we go on the other side, the damage to the wear and quality and the snow machine. So this is also happening because if it is ice, the machine, especially the snow mobiles and other things, can easily travel on that. But if it is a slush or if it is less ice, then they are going to be uneven and it is going to have a great effect on the travel. So some routes can no longer be traveled. In other words, the ice may be melted completely. So that means it is just water. So the snowmobiles cannot travel over that. And also it is more difficult to get on land and get country food. So that means the people cannot hunt now because if there is no ice, they cannot go to large part. Traveling in water is more difficult than traveling on ice for the local population. So this also affects how they survive. And also there is a shift in use of travel equipments, and that leads to purchasing of more vehicles. That means the cost becomes increasing and they cannot afford it, so they are suffering. And also it leads to health and economic impact because they cannot store their food. See, another major advantage if it is very cold is they can hunt and they can actually store the food for longer time. But when the temperature increases, this is no longer possible because in the very low temperatures, there is hardly any bacteria that exists in the Arctic region. But when the temperature increases, many of the microorganisms also grow, so they also affect the hunted food because they can simply store. If it is very cold, the hunted reindeer can be kept outside of the house also. So they will remain frozen for the entire winter, or maybe as long as the ice exists. When there is a cryosphere change, then these are all the things which the local population cannot do. And here is elaborate chart which talks about various forcing mechanisms and how the greenhouse gases are getting affected. So we have three different colors are there. So blue color means that is a decrease in whatever may be the effect that is happening. Red means there is an increase in that event that is happening. Ash color means it is more or less remaining the same. White color means people are not aware of what is actually happening. So we have various forcing mechanisms like sea ice, Greenland ice sheets, snow, permafrost, mountain glaciers, and lake and ice cap. So these are all the various cryospheric components which are present in the Arctic region, and the forcing mechanisms are basically the carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide and water vapor. These are all the greenhouse gases. These are all the forcing mechanisms. So how these affect each component that is present in the cryosphere is given here. Say for example, for the sea ice, and when we talk about the carbon dioxide, there is no conclusion on interaction between biological carbon drawn and physical processes. So that means we still have lots of inaccuracy in understanding what is actually happening. But if we go to the water vapor and the sea ice, so what is the relationship between these two things? Water vapor means there is a less sea ice leads to great evaporative surface, and great area of the ocean leads to warming, which will increase over the time. So that means it is a positive feedback. So sea ice is getting affected because of more water vapor that is present. And for example, if you look at the permafrost thawing leads to release of more methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So this leads to warming. So the red boxes are the one which are actually leading to a warming effect, and the blue one is the one which reduces the Arctic amplification. In other words, here what we see is carbon dioxide and the snow are having the negative effect. That means the decreased snow duration plus earlier onset of spring melt, this increases the primary production. That means more CO2 can be now captured, because if there is an increase in CO2, the melting of ice actually leads to more production, primary production. So this increases the cooling over time, because now more and more CO2 is being removed from the atmosphere. So these are all the forcing mechanisms and the cryospheric components, how they are affected. And here also another few forcing mechanisms are given. One is the surface albedo, another one is cloud, and then atmospheric circulation and thermohaline circulation. So if you look at surface albedo has lots of increase in temperature both in sea ice, snow, permafrost and mountain glaciers. All of the things are getting melted very quickly because of the surface albedo. And when we talk about cloud has actually the negative effect. So the cooling actually happens when the cloud is actually present. So that is what you can see here. So these are all the various ways the forcing mechanisms affect the cryosphere components in the Arctic region. So in the textual material, I will be discussing each one elaborately.